So, hello everybody. My name is Dan Rodney, and welcome to Noble Desktop's online seminar for secrets to creating high-res graphics for the web. Apple likes to call them Retina graphics. Other people call them either graphics or 2x graphics. And today I'm going to be explaining the difference between 1x, 2x, or as Apple calls them, Retina graphics. How do we create it? I'll be talking about Photoshop, Illustrator, Sketch, Adobe Experience Design, and going through the different apps. They have different workflows and different ways to do things, and I want to be sprinkling in tips and tricks along the way. So first, I will be explaining exactly what 1x and 2x graphics are, and then I'll dive into the programs and actually show you how to create them and show you some cool things. So in the beginning, even if you know what the difference between 1x and 2x are, just hang in there, and I will be getting to some cool tips and tricks. I'm sure you're going to pick up some stuff. Even if you've been creating graphics, you'll probably learn some cool things. And if you haven't, don't worry. That's what we're going to be covering today. I want to explain how to work in these different apps and the proper workflows and kind of things you should be doing to create these high-res web graphics. Just a little bit of background about Noble Desktop before I switch over and do a screen share. Noble Desktop's been around for 27 years. We're an Adobe certified training center, but we basically teach people how to design, how to code, and how to create things. And so whether it's designing web graphics or building iOS applications, video editing, photo retouching, these are the kind of things that we teach people. So definitely web design, web development is one of the big things that we teach. And so if you want to learn how to code HTML, CSS, JavaScript to create web pages, we teach that. And then we also teach the design apps to design the graphics that you're going to put into those websites as well. So we definitely teach a lot of the creative cloud applications, so Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Adobe Experience Design we're now teaching. We also teach non-Adobe apps, of course. We also teach things like Sketch and how to code, which is not necessarily an Adobe thing. That's just how to code things, whether it's coding web pages or coding iOS apps. We have hands-on classes that we offer in New York City. That's where I am right now. I'm in New York City. That's where Noble Desktop is based. And you can come to New York City to take our classes in person, but also most of our classes you can attend virtually online. They are live, so you attend while the class is running here in New York City. So some people come in person, and then some people tune in online and do a screen share into the instructor's computer. So you'll see on our website, if you ever look at any of our classes, some will say in NYC and live online. And any of the ones that say live online, you can attend virtually no matter where you are in the world. In addition to our great hands-on classes, we also sell workbooks for most of our classes, so you can also check them out on our website. They're step-by-step, hands-on, show you how to do the stuff. It's not just talking about it. We're actually walking you through step-by-step doing these things. So they're great ways to learn. And today, we're going to be talking about how to do this in a variety of apps. So we're going to dive into it now. I'm ready to get started. So I'm going to switch over to a screen here. All right. So, one other thing before we get too far into it. As a companion for today, I have this PDF that I made for you. And this is just a bunch of notes of things that we're going to be talking about today. A lot of information written down here of the topics that we're going to be covering. And that is in a link in the video's description. I will also post a link to that in the chat right now. So if you're attending live, there is a link to that. And this link will be in the video description. So if you're watching this as a recorded video later, or right now, if you're watching this as a recording, it's like this weird Back to the Future thing. I'm talking to future people that are going to be watching this video. Then you just click this link in the video description down below. Alrighty. So let's dive into it. First, I want to explain exactly what 1x and 2x graphics are and how they work. And then I'm going to go through the different apps and talk about workflows for creating these things. All right. So let me open up a page here. First of all, to understand the difference between low-res and high-res screens, we just have to understand just a little teeny bit of history of how screens have developed over the years. And years ago, we used to design for much smaller screens. We even started on even smaller screens than this. But as pixel counts increased, the general idea was that as pixel counts increased, for the most part, more pixels meant bigger screen. So 800 to 1024 to 1280, that just meant that your screen kept getting bigger and bigger, and it meant that you saw more stuff. So it's possible that the size of elements didn't change, but because you got a bigger screen, you could see more stuff next to each other. So in our web pages, as we adjusted, you only saw a little bit of content on your small screens, and then you saw more content, and it was just kind of a guess that we did, or we would look at our web stats to guess what is the average user using. And we could make an educated guess because most people that were coming to the site, if we looked at our web stats, it would tell us, oh, most of our viewers are on a 1024 screen, or most of our people are on a 1280. Some people could have a smaller screen, some people could have a bigger, but we would design for the average kind of screen that most people had. And then, of course, things changed with the phone coming out. So mobile phones and tablets changed all this idea. Now all of a sudden we had small screens, and so we had to change our design to responsive design, where we could design a web page that would look good across small, medium, and large screens. But still the idea of more pixels was a bigger screen still applied. Then the iPhone 4 came out with its Retina display, as Apple called it. So the main thing to understand about the iPhone 3 to the iPhone 4, and this is going back to when those phones were out, they were physically the same size. The iPhone 4 had more pixels, but it was not physically larger. We didn't see more stuff in the sense that we could see more things next to each other, right? It's not like we had a bigger display. We did have a better quality display. Those pixels were being used for a different purpose. Instead of seeing more stuff in terms of like on a bigger screen, you could see more photo thumbnails next to each other than on a small screen because it was bigger, so more stuff fit. Now the extra pixels were being used for more detail. So that's the more that we saw. We saw more detail. It was a sharper, clearer image. But it was physically, if you looked at an image, the full size on the iPhone 3 and the iPhone 4, you saw the same stuff, the same size, but you saw more clarity, you saw more details. So the fine details would be more visible on the iPhone 4. They took an old pixel on the iPhone 3 and basically cut it in half. So it was twice the width and twice the height made up the old pixel. And that's why we went from a 1x to a 2x screen. That's why they call it 2x. Twice the number of pixels width-wise or height-wise. Technically, if you cut a pixel in half, you're actually getting 4 pixels in every square that an old pixel used to be. And of course, this is greatly exaggerated. If I showed you the actual pixel sizes, they'd be really tiny. But so we actually had technically 4 times the number of pixels because it's twice the width and twice the height. But they didn't call it 4x. They just called it 2x because it was twice the width and twice the height. So they just called it 2x. So now all of a sudden when we think about a pixel isn't always the same way that we used to think of it. It used to be that when we made something 1024, we knew that that would be bigger than if it was 800 pixels wide. So the iPhone 3 was 320 pixels wide. The iPhone 4 was 640. But now we couldn't think of, well, if something is 640 versus 320, we're not getting to see twice as much stuff. We're getting to see twice as much detail. So when I first heard about this, I remember thinking, wait a minute, if I've designed a web page for a 320 pixel screen and I've hard-coded in, let's say I've hard-coded in a size of 320 pixels. If I made that web page 320 pixels, I remember thinking, how's this going to work on the new phone? Because in my code, it's 320 pixels. And technically speaking, in hardware, 320 pixels on the new iPhone was going to be only half the screen. So I thought, how's this going to work if it's taking my pixels literally? Well, the software was updated to not take those pixels in your code literally. They knew that when you said 320 pixels, which used to fill up the entire width of the screen on the iPhone 3, they knew to still fill up the width of the iPhone 4. But they knew that when you said 320 pixels, that they were going to use twice that number of pixels in hardware. So, the layout of the page would still be the same. So software pixels, the ones that we code in CSS and HTML, are still speaking the 1x sizes because that couldn't change. Now, when we're putting an actual graphic into an iPhone 4, if we've coded that graphic to fill up the entire width of the screen, in the code, I know it says 320 pixels, but if you give it an image that's only 320 pixels to fill out that space, you're not taking full advantage of the screen. You actually want to give it an image that's 640 pixels, one for every hardware pixel. And in the code, you tell it to be 320 pixels wide. So the code kind of shrinks it down in half. Even though the image is 640, we code it to be 320. By shrinking the image size in half, we double the effective resolution. The pixels get smaller because we scaled it in half. Let me give you another visual so that if that didn't make sense, this will hopefully start to explain things in a different way. So this is just a kind of a less figurative kind of graphic for you. On the left here, we have an image put into two different devices. Now, here we have a 1x image, and let's just say this is 320 pixels across. I exaggerated the number, the size of the pixels, but let's just pretend that that's 320 pixels across. The 2x image would be twice that width. So let's say that's 640 pixels across. Now, when you compare the 1x image and the 2x image at the same pixel size, so if you compare the pixel sizes of these two things, they're the same. If you compare them at the same pixel size, then the 2x image is twice as big. It's twice the width and twice the height. But that's not how we use them in a web page, or I know I'm talking about web pages here, but the same concept applies to applications as well. I'll just use web pages here for keeping the talk a little bit easier. It's twice the width and twice the height. So there's definitely a lot more detail. When you look at the type, there's definitely more detail in the type. You can see a little bit of roundness there that you just can't see in the 1x. And definitely in the car, there's a lot more detail here in the car than there is here in the 1x. But we don't want to compare them at the same pixel size because the pixels aren't going to be the same size when they're actually put onto the device. So let's take a 1x image, and if we put that 1x image, that low-res image, onto a low-res device and a high-res device, so I'm going to say that this black one here is a 1x, which would be like an iPhone 3, and the 2x would be like an iPhone 4. And I know I'm using the iPhone as an example, but the same idea applies to Android or Windows phones, so I'll just use iPhone as an example, but it still works in other types of manufacturers. That 1x image on both devices is going to look the same. It's a low-res image, and putting it on a high-res device doesn't make it look any better. It's going to look the same. It's not going to look any worse on the high-res device. It doesn't make it look worse. That's how it used to always look, so it looks the same. I think when people think that low-res graphics look bad on a high-res screen, a lot of times it's in comparison to what it can be. So especially if you see things like really sharp type next to a slightly pixelated logo, it's that you can compare them right next to each other, that you see, hey, wait, this one looks better than the other thing. But this is how we used to see all of our graphics on 1x devices, and they looked good. But of course, Retina or 2x devices certainly look better. So I think it's kind of good and better, not that the Retina graphics are good and the 1x ones were bad. Now, if you take a high-res image and you put that onto a low-res screen, that low-res screen doesn't have the physical pixels to show all the detail that's in that 2x image. So it's not going to look any better than a 1x image would. It's limited by the hardware. But if you put that 2x image, that high-res image, onto a high-res device, well, now that's going to look better. Okay, so now you can definitely see that this looks crisper and sharper than the 1x graphic does. The downside to doing this is that if you give a 2x image to a low-res device, they don't get any benefit, but they do have to download a bigger file size. Now, at this point, pretty much every mobile phone and tablet out there are all high-res screens. So in the mobile and tablet space, it's really not so much of a concern to be creating 1x images anymore. You could just deliver high-res images to everybody, and basically everybody has high-res screens, so you'd be pretty safe. Of course, to be perfectly optimal, you would create a 1x and a 2x and code up your website to deliver the 1x or the 2x, just in case there are people with 1x screens out there. But it's just a matter of time until everybody does get high-res screens, so you have to decide. Now, if you have a lot of graphics and your target audience maybe doesn't have the fastest internet connection, especially for things like photos, a lot of times in photos you can get away with delivering 1x graphics to both screens, and some people won't notice, especially people that don't have perfect vision. Like I know people that don't have perfect vision and they literally can't tell the difference between a low res and a high res graphic on their phone just because their eyes aren't good enough. So high res graphics are bigger. If bandwidth is a concern, with things like photographs, which are more forgiving, you can still deliver 1x graphics to both, and you can get a smaller file size that loads faster. Where you really notice the 2x high res screens and the quality is in things like logos. When you're dealing with logos, though, you can be saving your web graphics as scalable vector graphics, which I'll be showing you how to do. And with those scalable vector graphics, or SVG for short, they can take advantage of all the pixels in your screen, however low or high res it is, and they download fast, and you don't have to worry about low res and high res because it's a vector graphic. So things like type, logos, these things, you don't require pixel-based graphics, so you don't have to worry about high and low res different files. And that's why we really want to move to vector graphics for our vector icons and logos and use proper web fonts instead of making type into an image, for example. Okay, so that's the difference between 1x and 2x, and hopefully that starts to explain it. Now, let me give you one other demonstration here. And in this file, I have a series of images where I've made 1x and 2x graphics just so you can compare the difference. Now this is where if you're streaming in Retina quality, the highest quality that's available, hopefully you'll be able to see some of a difference here. I'm not sure how much YouTube's compression is going to affect the quality of this. If you're viewing this on a 1x screen, you're not going to be able to see too much of a difference in some of these images because you don't have a Retina screen. As I get further down, you will be able to see a difference in some of them because they actually go less than 1x. But you're still going to understand some concepts even if you can't completely see these because maybe your internet connection is too slow or you might not have a Retina screen. This image that I've put in here, right now this is a 2400 pixel wide image that in my HTML or CSS I've coded to be 1200 pixels wide. So basically the image pixels are twice of the size that I'm putting it into the web page. So that means it's a 2x graphic. Now if I hit the toggle button, I switch to a different image where it's 1200 pixels wide for the actual image, and I've also coded it to be 1200 pixels wide. And I just switch back and forth. This is the Retina image, and this is the non-Retina image. And the Retina image, the 2x image, is definitely sharper and crisper than the 1x. Now this is where sometimes you can notice a big difference, but then other times you can't necessarily notice a big difference. And in some places in this image, there's a considerable difference. In other parts, there aren't. I can see some more grain here in the high-res image, but that's not super important detail. You definitely notice it in the needles. You see more of a difference there. Now, just as another example, the same deal here. This is 2400 pixels in the image, scaled down to 1200 pixels within the web page. So I basically shrunk it in half. And as I switch between the two, this is the high-res graphic, this is the low-res graphic. The low-res graphic definitely lacks some detail that we could have. Depending on the part of it, you might not notice a huge difference, but in some parts, like the trees and the texture here in the street, you could definitely notice a difference between them. Now, even if you couldn't notice those things, as I get down to this demo, you should be able to see at least some of these as I go further down. In this part, I've taken the same exact image and I've coded it to be different sizes. And I think this is the thing that really will hopefully help you to start to understand web resolution, especially if you're used to print. A lot of people that are doing print graphics switching over to do web have a hard time understanding exactly how resolution works for web graphics. And before I show this, let me just bounce over here to Photoshop and talk about web resolution for a moment. I'm just going to create a web document right here, and this one will be fine. All right, so no, I don't want to do that right now. I'm going to go into my image size here. Resolution. Resolution doesn't matter at all for web. Doesn't matter. This little setting right here is meaningless for web design. That's what really gets, especially print people, they're like, I don't understand why that doesn't matter. I literally do not care what you type in here for the resolution, whether it's 72, 144, 1 pixel, or 1,000, because the website does not use that resolution. Now, what matters, let me uncheck resample here. What matters is the pixel count. All right, let me switch over here to pixels. There we go. Yeah, I want to be in pixels. So when I have 1,024 pixels, if I have more pixels, that means more information. So if I have 2,000 pixels, that means I have more information. If I have 3,000 pixels, that means I have more information. So in that sense, pixels definitely matter. And that does end up creating a higher res file, if you will. When I say resolution doesn't matter, I'm talking about this resolution setting here in Photoshop. That doesn't matter. The amount of pixels in your file definitely matter. If I have a 100 pixel image, that does not have much resolution. It does not have much information in the file. If I have 1,000 pixel image, I have much more information. If I have 2,000 pixels, I have twice as much information. So you want more pixels for higher quality, but the resolution is ignored. The reason for that is because web pages only care about the width or the height that you're putting in to the web page. You're dictating in the web page the size that the image is going to be displayed. When you bring it into a web page, this resolution setting is ignored. And that's unusual for print people because if you're using InDesign, for example, InDesign actually looks at this resolution to determine when you have 2,000 pixels, how big should that be on the page? Should that be an 8 by 11? Should that be a 5 by 7? That would change your resolution. But web pages don't listen to this value. Web pages just look at width and height. And let me show you why. Because here I can take the same 600 pixel wide image and I can code it to be any size that I want. If I code it to be 300 pixels wide, we have a beautiful high-res Retina graphic because I've coded 600 pixels to be half the size. I've shrunk them, which makes a higher res file. What the web page cares about is how I've coded the size. I make it 300 pixels, and if I give it 600 pixels, then it's going to be high res. Now here I've taken the same exact image that's 600 pixels, and I've coded it to be the same 600 pixels. And when there's a one-to-one relationship there, that means it's a 1x low-res graphic. Same image can be a Retina graphic or a non-Retina graphic, a 2x or a 1x, just it all depends on how big you code it. So if you give me an image and tell me to put it into a web page, I have to know how you intended that, how big you intended that to be. If you just give me a 600 pixel image, unless you tell me if that's supposed to be Retina or not, I don't know. That's why when we name our files with Retina graphics, we normally put at 2x in the file name, and that tells people that should be coded at half the image size. If there's no at 2x in the file name, then I'm going to assume that it's a 1x graphic, and I will code it the same size as the image. Now, here I've made something a half x. Now, this is not a very good looking image, and this is where people can start to see this, no matter what size screen you have. It's a 600 pixel image, but I've blown it up. I've made it 1,200 pixels wide in the web page. So I've actually made the image look worse. And finally, I've taken that same 600 pixel wide image, and you can code up things to be flexible. And this hopefully will really illustrate to people, especially that are having a hard time understanding resolution on the web, is that the web determines what the resolution is. Resolution is just pixels per inch. So depending on how many pixels wide our image is and how you code it, that will determine the resolution. Okay? So I made a fluid resolution here, one that's constantly changing based on my screen width. I've coded this image to be 100% wide. So as I resize my browser window, By making it smaller, I am increasing the resolution of that image. It's becoming higher res as I make it smaller. It looks better now than it did when it was big. So this is even less than 0.5x because I've made it even bigger than that. So the same image, just depending on how big I make it, can be anywhere from really crappy down to really good quality, just depending on how big I make it in the web page. And so that's why all we really care about when we're creating our Retina graphics is not that resolution setting in Photoshop. It's just how many pixels am I giving it? And how many pixels is that going to be coded in the final web page? And keep in mind that code talks about 1x pixels. So your actual image should always be twice what it's going to be coded. Okay? So hopefully that explains a bit better what's going on here. And so somebody in the chat was saying more pixels equals smaller pixels. In the case of the Retina phones or the 2X phones, because they were the same physical size, oops, let's go to this one. Because the phones were the same physical size and they inserted more pixels, they did get smaller. And so yes, the more pixels in this case meant smaller pixels. In fact, it was half the size that it used to be. And because they're so small, now they're so small that you can't see them. That's why Apple calls it a Retina display, because held at a normal distance, the human eye cannot perceive anything smaller than that. It's the limit of the human eye, unless you get bionic eyes. Anything beyond 2x is kind of a waste because you can't physically see it. I mean, maybe if you put the phone really, really, really close, maybe you could start to see something higher, but at any sort of normal viewing distance, all you need to go is 2x, and anything beyond is kind of not needed. Now, Photoshop makes dealing with 1x and 2x a bit harder. So I'm going to start with Photoshop, in part because it is very popular. A lot of people use it, but also because Photoshop does make this a bit more confusing. It's definitely easier to think about creating Retina graphics in something like Illustrator or Sketch or Adobe Experience Design because they get the web workflow better. Photoshop is a bit too literal about pixels, and so it makes it a little bit more challenging as a web designer working in Photoshop, because we have to understand that Photoshop doesn't understand this software pixel like we have in HTML and CSS, and that there's maybe not a one-to-one relationship between that and the web browser. So let me explain here. In Photoshop, you have to choose a size for your file, right? So if you're designing for a 1x screen, you're going to be designing, let's say, I'm going to click view more presets here. Let's say this 1280 by 800 screen. If you're going to design for 1280, that would be in code 1280 pixels wide. In CSS and HTML, you'd say 1280. But if that was a Retina screen, it would be twice that. So it would be 1280 times 2. So your actual image files, if you wanted to fill up that screen, the actual image files would be 2560 pixels because it would be twice that. Photoshop doesn't understand this idea. So let me close here. So here is a Photoshop file that I've made as 1x. And here's one that I made as 2x. Now notice that the type sizes are exactly the same in terms of size. But to get Photoshop to make them the same size, in the 1x file, I had to tell Photoshop to make this 20 pixel text. And in the 2x file, I had to tell Photoshop to make this 40 pixel text. Let me zoom out just a hair here. Let's see if I can get the good zoom level for you to be able to see this. There we go. Yeah, so Photoshop doesn't understand what browsers understand. When the new browsers came out on these high-res devices, the software had to be intelligent, because if it literally mapped 1 pixel in our code to 1 pixel on the screen, everything just would have shrunk in half. But they knew to abstract the software pixel from the hardware pixel. So in code, if I coded up a web page and said, make this text 20 pixels, in a 1x display, it would use 20 pixels to draw that. In a 2x display, it knows to use 40 pixels so that they end up looking the same. if you have a 3x display, because there are now 3x displays, it would know to use not 20 pixels, not 40 pixels, but 60 pixels. It would be 3 times the amount. So you just have to code once. You code 20 pixels, and the browser knows I'll use 20, I'll use 40, I'll use 60. It knows. It does the math. We don't have to worry about that when we're coding. So that a coded pixel is always the same kind of amount of physical space, and that might be broken up into smaller hardware pixels, but we don't have to worry about that. Photoshop doesn't understand that idea. Their pixel is a literal pixel. Their pixels talk to hardware pixels, essentially. And so we have to double it if we want to work in a 2x file. So let me show you here. Let me create a new file. And let's do that 1280 by 800. Okay. And actually, let's just keep the math easy here. Let's just do 1200. So this is a 1200 file. I'm going to name this artboard here 1200. So that would be a 1x low-res file. Now let me create a new document. This is going to be twice that. Actually, you know what? The easiest way is just for me to duplicate this document, and I'm going to call this high-res. And in this document, I'm going to make my artboard twice the size. So times 2. Let me see if they let me do times 2. Nah, they're not letting me do math. Okay, I can do the math myself. 1200 goes times 2, 2400. 800 times 2, 1600. So this is now a 2400 2x high-res document. Now, how I view this on my screen, there's a very important difference between low-res screens and high-res screens. You have to know what screen you're designing on. Right now, I am designing on a 15-inch MacBook Pro Retina screen. So I'm designing on a Retina screen. Look at the difference between 100% in Photoshop and 100% here. Notice the difference in the file size. Let me just hit Tab to get rid of my interface. Look at the difference in the size of these documents. Both are at 100%, like the actual size, the correct size. But notice that the high-res is twice the size as this. And this is not an appropriate size kind of for a web page. For this document, I'd really have to zoom in to 200% to get it to be the correct size. Now notice that they're the same size. Now, if you're designing on a low-res screen, you'd have the opposite. And just to make this a little bit easier here, instead of doing new files here, let me open up a file where I've got an actual design. I'll open up the desktop design here. This will help us to see something in the page instead of just a white page. I'm going to check out the image size here. And yeah, because this particular file does not use an artboard. Let's go over here to pixels. So this is 2048. So that's twice a 1024 resolution. So this is a high-res file. Notice that in the name I put at 2x so that I know that it's a high-res file. When I view this on my high-res screen at 100%, everything is actual size. So basically, if your file and your screen match, 100% is trustworthy in Photoshop. So 2x file on a 2x screen, I can trust the size. Now let me duplicate this. I'm going to make this a 1x design. And I'm going to go into my image size. And I'm going to make this cut in half. So let's go to percentage and say 50%. It's going to cut it in half. All right. So now if I view this at 100%, look at how small it is. It's half the size it's supposed to be. So if I'm designing on a high-res screen, but I've got a low-res file, I have to zoom in to 200%. Now, I zoomed into 200%. I don't know if you can tell the quality of this, but the quality is not as good. It's a low-res file on a high-res screen, and that means that it's slightly pixelated. When I look at my 2x file, it's nice and sharp. But my 1x file is a bit blurry and pixelated. It's not horribly ugly, but it's not showing me as much as it could because it's a low-res file. That's how it works on a high-res screen. Now, let's say you have a low-res screen. for you on a low-res screen, if your low-res screen matches the low-res file, for you, 100% is going to be the trustworthy size. And it'll look fine. It's going to look as good as it can be because you're on a low-res screen with a low-res file. That's the limit of what your screen is capable of outputting. When you, on a low-res screen, switch to a high-res file, when you view it at 100%, it's going to be huge because you've got all these pixels in the file that are way beyond the capabilities of your screen. Everything's giant. You're going to have to zoom out to 50%. Now, I know mine says 100%, but that's because I'm on a high-res screen. You're going to have to zoom out to 50% to get that to be a normal size. Then they would match the same size. Now, because you're at 50%, you're not seeing the full capabilities of what's in the file because you're limited by your screen. Your screen can't output Retina quality because you're on a low-res screen. You can view the file, but you can't really see all the quality that's in it. But at least you could work on it. So you just have to really know what kind of file you're working on and what your display is to know at what percentage is going to be a trustworthy size. Okay. So that's really important when choosing the resolution and your zoom to work on. Now, there's pluses and minuses, they're kind of pros and cons for designing at 1x or 2x. And I just want to point out, this link is in the notes, but on my blog here, actually both of these links are in the download. I have 2 posts on my blog, danrodney.com/blog, designing Retina web graphics. So if you want to kind of have a written version of what we're talking about today, this is 1x. Oh, this is should you work at 1x or 2x? So this whole blog post just explores what are the pros and cons of working at 1x or 2x in Photoshop. And then the other article that I have down here, which is just explaining 1x and 2x. So if you want kind of a written version of what I'm talking about today for just understanding 1x versus 2x, there's a great article here where I give some of those same graphics here. And actually that same interactive demo, if you click on that, you can actually get that same interactive demo if you want to see it on your own screen for yourself. Okay. So those are some blog posts if you want to read more and kind of check out that information there. So there's pros and cons about designing at 1x and 2x, and let me go through those. The good things about 1x is that when you're designing your type sizes, 80 pixels is what you're going to see in the code when you eventually create this web page. When you hand this off to a web developer, 80 pixels in your file is going to be 80 pixels in your code. There's nothing to worry about in that sense. So that's good. That's a positive. In a 2x file, there's that issue where the type sizes are doubled because it's twice the number of pixels, and it doesn't understand how to translate this into a web pixel. It's a literal pixel. They're giving hardware pixels, not the coded pixels. So one of the downsides in working in 2x is that all your type sizes are doubled. In fact, every size is doubled. We're talking strokes. Instead of a 1 pixel stroke, it would be 2 pixel strokes. Because everything you do in a 2x file is essentially going to be cut in half when it's coded or put into a web page. So you actually have to, in a 2x file, always work in even increments. You have to do 2 pixel strokes or 4 pixel strokes, because when it translates into code, you have to cut that value in half, and we can't have half pixels. So in a 2x high-res file, you can't design a 3 pixel stroke because that's going to be cut in half, and we cannot have a 1.5 pixel stroke in our web page. So as long as you make sure that you work in even amounts, 2, 4, 6, 8, then everything will be fine. Just don't do odd amounts, and you'll be okay. It's a little bit of a hassle, but eventually when you give this to a web developer, if they don't like that they have to do all the math to cut it in half, just keep in mind that you could always go into your image size and just shrink it by 50% and give them that file, and Photoshop will have done all the math. It'll have cut all your strokes in half and your type sizes in half. So it's just an issue when you're designing that all of your amounts are going to be double what they would normally be. That's kind of the biggest drawback, I think, in terms of working in 2x. But to me, the benefits outweigh that. The benefits are that you're working on a high-res file that's beautiful. As I design, I want to see the maximum quality that I can design with. Once you work on a Retina display, you want to take full advantage of that Retina display. To see the pixelated graphics, you're really not seeing exactly how your end result is going to look. One of the reasons that I mainly focused on Retina graphics is because eventually all displays are going to become Retina screens. It's kind of like right now, you cannot buy a black and white display for your monitor. You have to buy a color display. Who would want a black and white display? Well, eventually it's going to be the same thing with Retina displays. All displays are going to become Retina 2X displays. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. On the desktop, it's still transitioning. There's still a lot of people on your desktop or laptop that don't have a Retina screen. They will eventually, but that's taking a while. In mobile tablets, mobile phones, basically everybody's already on high-res screens. So that's transitioned much faster because people get a new phone or tablet at a much faster rate. But the desktops, they last longer. So it's going to take a number of years before that happens. But if everybody's eventually going to have Retina displays and that's going to become the norm, I'd want to see what the normal thing is kind of moving forward. So I want to work on a Retina display so I can see all the detail in my file, and I want to work in a Retina file so I can see all the detail my display can output. Other issues are if you export graphics, it's never a problem to kind of scale the graphic down in terms of quality, because scaling down produces a perfectly fine quality. You can export at the current size for 2x, and you can scale it 50% size for the 1x, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. In a 1x file, you'd have to blow it up twice as big to get the 2x file. Now, if you're very careful, you can get away doing that, but you have to make sure that you work with smart objects for things like your photos. So you have to make sure that you're dealing with a smart object and that smart object has all the resolution necessary. But there's bugs that come out. Like in Photoshop, for example, if you place in a file, if you go to File, Place, and it doesn't matter whether it's linked or embedded, if you place in a JPEG as a smart object, which is what the place does, when you place that in, even if you have a very high-res JPEG, and it could potentially be exported at 200%, Photoshop has a bug. It doesn't work. You just get a big blurry version of that. And so because of that bug in upscaling JPEGs when you export, that's an issue. When you're designing a 2x files, you don't have that issue. So let me show you how to export files. I'll show you how to export from both. And this bug that I'm talking about is working on Adobe Generator. Okay, so there's a beautiful way that you can export both 1x and 2x assets from the same original source layer. And it's using something called Adobe Generator. Now, it's not the most intuitive thing. You wouldn't just stumble upon this, but once you know how to do it, it is very, very powerful. So Adobe Generator is in the File menu under Generate, Image Assets. Notice it is not turned on right now. So let me step back for a second here. I'm going to put a folder. I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call it Design. And I'm going to put my design in there so we can just concentrate on that one folder. Notice there's nothing else in that folder. Let me open up this file. Now, I've gone through and I've named my layers in a very specific way. Let's just name this hero at 2x.jpg. This is a 2x file, so exporting at the current size would yield a 2x exported asset. So I'm going to write in 2x in my file name. Just putting in .jpg says to make it a JPEG. So just by putting in the file extension, we tell Adobe Generator how we want to export. So up here, for example, let's do this. Hipster logo. And so you want to give it a good web name, like keep everything lowercase, don't put spaces in your name. And then I'm saying at 2x because I want to remember that this is a 2x graphic. The at 2x doesn't do anything special in terms of scaling or do anything. It just lets me know that that's a 2x graphic. What is special here is that I'm naming it .png, and that's going to export a PNG out of that logo. We'll talk about exporting other file types in just a moment. But let's say we want to have a PNG and a JPEG. Just by naming it .jpg and .png, we're going to get those. Pretty awesome. We just have to turn on the generator. Once we turn on Generate Image Assets, vroom vroom, back in the background, the engine's on, and it's going to create a folder. And in that folder, it's going to create the assets. Now, obviously, I've named some other layers appropriately. Let's just take a look at the ones that I did. Here's the hero at 2x.jpg. So here's that asset. And then the hipster logo, here's that asset. So those were exported from the file just by naming it. Now those were with the default options. You can go in there and set things like the compression. So this is by default a fairly high quality JPEG, and it's pretty big. It's 250K. We can knock that down by going at the end of the JPEG and putting in a quality setting. If I say 5, that would be a 50% quality JPEG. And I come back and automatically in the background, it's re-exported it with a lower quality. Now it's only 52K. It's awesome. Now if you want to do 6, that would be 60%. If you want something in between, you can actually say 55%. But otherwise, just a single number assumes that it's 50% for 5, or if you do 8, it would be 80%. Just give it a second in the background, it'll export. And so you just have to name things, which is great. All right, now that's for the 2x file. And some people are just going towards 2x files, especially for things like mobile phones and tablets. But let's say on a desktop, this is a desktop design. There's still a lot of people that have a 1x desktop. Let's say we want to give also a 1x file. You can edit this name and put a comma, space, and then another file name to export it a second way. I'm going to export this now with a different name, just hero.jpg, because this is going to be the 1x. And again, I can specify quality. Let's do the same. Let's just shorten these up to 50 quality for both of those. And then I come back to my desktop and there's hero JPEG and hero at 2x. Oh, wait a minute. They're the same file size. Just naming it didn't make it smaller. It exported at the current size. I need to do something to tell it, let's make it a smaller size. So at the very beginning, I can say 50%. And so there's the first file name. And since there's no size, it exports current size. Then I put a comma, a space. I put the size that I want to export, another space, and I put in the new file name, and finally the quality. This exact syntax is indicated in the handout that I've given you, and I go through a variety of different examples, so you can reference that handout. Now, oh, okay, now that's a lot smaller, 21K versus 52. If I open this in my desktop and I switch between them using my arrow keys, on the Mac they have this nice way that you can hit spacebar to preview, and you can go back and forth. Any recent version of the Mac OS actually shows you them at the same size, just that the 2x looks better quality than the 1x. If you open these up in a browser or Photoshop or something like that, you would actually see that if you compare them at the same zoom level, like 100% zoom and 100% zoom, you'd see that the 2x is twice the width and twice the height. But we're not really supposed to think of them that way, because we're supposed to think of them as, let's display them in the same physical space, but when you have more pixels crammed into that space, the 2x will look better than the 1x. That's how we're supposed to think about them. More pixels mean more detail, not bigger image. Okay. So with this, you can do amazing things. Now, the only thing is that when you're exporting your JPEGs, this is one of the secrets that a lot of people don't realize. You should not be using the same quality setting for a 2x and a 1x. They should be different qualities. If I look at this, the 1x looks kind of pixelated, and I'm starting to see colors introduced because I've compressed it too much. I'm starting to see artifacts that are undesirable and color artifacts that are undesirable. I've compressed that 1x graphic too much. Now the 2x graphic looks fine. It looks nice and sharp and crisp, and I don't have that those same amount of artifacts. So what you can get away with on a 2x is a lot more compression. In fact, I'm going to go down to 30% quality on my 2x. Now let's go down and preview this again. I'm starting to see a little bit of that color, the color artifacting. Maybe I went a little bit too much because I can see that at 100%. These fine details, by the way, I'm not sure how all of this is going to come through in the YouTube live stream, just because when you're really judging specific optimization settings, You can see them really well on your own monitor, but I don't know about the video stream, how well you'll be able to see this. I'm going to try to pop up to maybe 40% quality on that and see if that does a little bit of a better job. Yeah, now I don't notice that at all. I would actually try 35% on that. So I type in 35% and see how that goes. Yep, 35. I think 35 is a sweet spot. Still looks good, but 30 was a little bit too much. But now we still have the same issue that on the 1X, I mentioned the 1X is too compressed. So I need to go back, and for the 1X, 50 was too low a quality. I need to go up. Let's try 70%. That looks better. I still see some color artifacts in there. I think I might need to go just a little bit higher. Let's try 75% on that, because it was pretty good. Just needed to bump up just a little bit more. Yep, that looks nice. So now the difference when I switch between the 2X and the 1X, this isn't necessarily, that doesn't have the most detail for you to really see, but definitely I see more detail in the 2X bubbles here. A lot of the image is blurry, so I don't have a lot of clarity to really see much of a difference here. But look at this. The 2X graphic, even though it has twice the width and twice the height, so it has 4 times the number of pixels, it is not even double the file size. Properly optimized, your 2X JPEGs can come down, so they are only a little bit bigger than your 1X JPEGs. The 1X JPEGs will be smaller, but they don't have to be considerably smaller. So, moral of this story is always compress your high-res graphics to a much lower quality. Like, compress the heck out of them. Your 1X graphics have to be a much higher quality. The reason this works is because with the 2X files, the pixels are so small. So all the artifacts that are created are half the size that they are in a 1X. Because all the artifacts are half the size, you notice them half as much. So you can end up really compressing it and creating huge artifacts that eventually are big enough that you can see again. In general, I would say go lower than 50% quality on your high-res images. So go less than 50%. And on your low-res graphics, go above 50%. And yeah, and there was a question in the chat. On the desktop, I'm just hitting the space bar to preview those, and you can go back and forth using your arrow keys. It is a Mac feature to be able to hit the space bar to preview. It's one of my favorite features about working on a Mac, is just to be able to hit that space bar to preview and just arrow through the files. If you're on Windows, you can certainly open those up either in a web browser or in Photoshop. I do actually like opening them up in a web browser where you can get different tabs. And you just want to make sure, though, that you're viewing at the right size. So, for example, in this case, if I make my browser window that wide, in the other page here, it's kind of scaled down. Like, it doesn't have to scale down, but if I click on it, it does scale down. Notice they're the same size now. So they're kind of the same end size. I can compare the difference in quality here in my browser. By being in a browser, if I ever re-export new versions, I can just hit the refresh button to go get the latest version of it. So that's kind of nice if you're on Windows to just preview in a browser. Or you could open up in Photoshop if you want. Okay. All right. Oh, and there was a question, how do you magnify in the Finder? You can, in the Finder, well, I'm doing a different thing, which you have to sometimes set up. In the Finder, you could just pinch to zoom if you want to zoom in. I think there's a keystroke for it. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think you might be able to use a scroll wheel. I don't have a mouse connected right now to try it. A lot of times I use a trackpad, so I can just do pinch to zoom. But I know there's other ways you can zoom as well. Or you can also just resize your preview. Initially, it opens up to the correct size. Okay. So now, let's say you didn't want to work in a 2x file. Let's say you wanted to work in a 1x file. You could still export the proper stuff. So let me shrink this down to 50%. All right. So now I'm in a 1x file. If I look at my image size, this is 1024. That's a 1x size. If you're designing in this, just keep in mind that when you're on a high-res screen, you're going to have to zoom to 200% for this to look the proper size. It's not going to look nice and sharp. It's going to be a bit pixelated, but you can export your low res and high res from this file. In that case, the current size that I'd be exporting is a 1x. So I'd be saying hero.jpg. And I'd be doing the higher quality. And then I want to go 200% to make it bigger, to create the hero at 2x. Can't spell today here. .jpg, and that would still be the lower quality, and I think that was 35% I figured out. So the main difference here is just that you're going up in size from your low res, and you better have used smart objects for this, and actually smart objects that weren't originally a JPEG. So you want to make sure that you have like a Photoshop file that you're placing in, or a TIFF. So be really careful if you go onto stock photo sites and it's really easy to download JPEGs. Make sure you convert them to like a Photoshop or a TIFF first before you bring them in, or you can copy and paste them and then convert to a smart object. Okay. Oh, somebody was saying in the chat that you could do Command plus to enlarge. Let's go up, open this. Not in the Finder, no. In Photoshop you can, but that's not in the Finder. Yeah. Okay, so that's the deal with Photoshop. As long as you know what screen you're working on and what file you're working on, you can design either in 1x or 2x. As I explained on my blog post, I definitely think that working in 2x is definitely the way to go, but you can work in both. Now, one of the issues with Photoshop is dealing with vector stuff. I know that this was done as a PNG, but really it shouldn't be done as a PNG. It should be, for web pages, exported as an SVG file. Now, that said, we still might export as PNGs if we're doing things like HTML email, because in HTML email you can't use SVG files, but we're talking about web page design here. So let's say we're creating a web page, then SVG is the way we want to go. So Photoshop lets you export as an SVG file, and you'll think that it worked, but you must be very careful. In many cases, it didn't work properly. Let's go and take a look at what it exported. See, it looks like an SVG file. It really does. But let's open that up in my code editor to see the code, because SVG files are vector coded files. And unfortunately, what it embedded into this is an image that's a PNG. So it turned my logo into a PNG and embedded it into an SVG. Now, that's a lot of acronyms there. But basically what it did is, if you think about, if you maybe are familiar with PDF files. Now, PDF files can contain vector information and pixel-based information. So if you make a PDF of a brochure, your type and your logos can be vector, and your photographs can be pixel-based. So PDF supports native vector and pixel-based in the same file format. SVG is basically the same kind of thing, except we have a coded file. So in an SVG file, you can have vector-only information, or you can have pixel and vector information. In this case, Photoshop created an SVG container, but it never actually put any vector information in it. It only put pixel-based information. The reason is because this is a vector smart object that I copied and pasted from Illustrator. And they don't understand this. They cannot export, they don't look into the Illustrator file to extract the vectors and then export them. They could, in theory, support this. They just don't. The only time that your SVG export will work is if it's natively a vector in Photoshop. Like if you've used any of these native vector drawing tools here in Photoshop, then it will export a vector from that. But that's very rare that I'm actually doing that. A lot of times I come from Illustrator, copy and paste into Photoshop, and I size it. So that means you cannot export SVG a lot of times from Photoshop. In some cases you can, but in most I find that you can't. It's not too big of a deal because you're only 2 clicks away from Illustrator though. If I double click on the thumbnail for this, double click on that, it reminds me that it's going to open up another program, and when I'm done, to save the changes. So I don't need to see this again. I'll just click OK. So here I'm over in Illustrator now. It just wants to know, do I want to keep the changes or discard the changes and preserve Illustrator's editing capabilities? sometimes, and I don't know why it detects this change, it hasn't actually really changed, but whatever it thinks changed, I want to keep it. I want to make sure that it's the same. I don't want it going in and editing things. So let's just keep it. Okay. So here I've got a vector in Illustrator. Let me switch to outline mode just so you can see. These are vector outlines. Okay. Now, from Illustrator, you can export. You can do an export as if you're running the latest versions of Illustrator. If you go to export and you don't have an export as, then in older versions of Illustrator, you can do a save as. So in the older versions of Illustrator, you can save as SVG. Or in the latest versions of Illustrator, it's better to do an export as. The export as SVG is supposed to be more optimized code, and it should be a smaller file size, so it downloads faster for the end website viewer. So I'd rather get a smaller file size. Let me export this to my desktop as hipsterlogo.svg. Click export. And in here, if you have any type that's actually type, it can stay as SVG type. So the fonts, they're going to become SVG. So it's actually live type. The only thing is that your website actually has to serve up the font that's needed. And if you're not, then your font might change. If you don't want to have to worry about loading web fonts into your web page to make sure that the fonts display right, you might just want to convert to outlines. In this case, I don't have any live type, so that won't have any issue. It doesn't matter which one I switch because I don't have any live type. But if you want to play it safe and you want to make sure that it's going to look the same, convert to outlines. It is kind of nice for accessibility purposes to have real type in SVG files, though. So if you are already loading the font, then you could keep it as an SVG font. Doesn't matter for me. I'm not doing that because this is a logo. Even though it's type, it's custom drawn type, and so this is a piece of art. This is a default thing that you definitely want to uncheck, though, responsive. Uncheck responsive. I know this is checked, and it sounds like you'd want to be responsive. If you're not familiar with what the term responsive is, a responsive website adapts to any size screen. It's all the rage in web design now for years that we want to create responsive websites. One that will look good on a mobile phone, a tablet, and a desktop. Why would you not want your graphics to be responsive, you may ask? Because what this really should be called is omit width and height. Okay, so if you omit the width and height, that makes it responsive. That means there is no coded width and height. It will fill out whatever size container you put it in. And therein lies the problem. Normally in a web page, you don't want your graphic to just fill out the container that you're putting it in. You probably want to build it at a size and have it remember that size. So if you uncheck this, it will remember its size. Kind of like a pixel-based photo. When you make a pixel-based photo, you know how big you made it. And the same way with a vector. I want it to remember how big I made it. Now it's vector, so if I want to make it bigger in my web page, I still can, and I won't lose any quality, but I want it to remember the initial size that I made it. In part because this fixes issues with Internet Explorer. There can be some browser display issues where it gets the sizing wrong. If you leave this checked, there will be no width and height coded into the file, and that can create some issues with Internet Explorer and even Microsoft Edge, the new version of Internet Explorer. And then the other thing is that if you leave responsive on, the web developer always has to code in the width and height every single time they use it. If you uncheck it, it codes in the width and height. And then the web developer can just bring it in. It comes in at the size you intended it to be. And they only have to code a width and height if they want to change it. And that's fine if they do because it's vector. It's going to look beautiful whether they shrink it down or enlarge it. It doesn't matter. So you want to minify to keep your file size small, but you don't want to have responsive checked. Uncheck that. Click OK, and then you'll get an SVG. So that's the main tip that I wanted you to walk away with is uncheck responsive. And then you get a nice little SVG file. Now, I will point out that in this case, the SVG file is 7K. And if I pop back over here, you might have noticed that, let's re-export from Photoshop this as a PNG. You might have noticed that the PNG is only 3K. So you might say, hey, why would I go with an SVG file if this is so small? No, actually, part of that was that it was a low-res version. So let's make the 2X. I'm going to go 200%, and this is going to be the 2x. Let's make the 2x. Okay, 6K. But still, you say, well, that's 6K. And if the pixel-based one is 6K and the vector-based one is 7K, why wouldn't I just go with the pixel-based one? Well, for a couple reasons. The biggest one is this actually probably won't be 7K when you actually deliver it to users on the website. Good websites are going to be coded so that they turn on what's called gzip compression or some type of other compression. And anything that's a text file, and SVG are actually their text files, they're coded files. If I open this up in my code editor, it's just coded coordinates. So it's essentially a text file that creates a graphic. Things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and SVG, they can all be compressed by the server and sent out to users, so they're actually smaller. Now, things like gzipping can save anywhere from 20 to 60% of your file size or more. And so most likely this file, when gzipped by the web server, is not going to be 7K. It could be maybe 3K. And the beauty of this file is that in one file, it looks great on every device, 1x, 2x, 3x, at any size you make it. That PNG that we created was very limited. It only worked, didn't mean to double click on that. It was only appropriate for the size that we created it. If we ever want to make it bigger, we're going to lose quality. So SVG is definitely the way to go. And it's just so much better quality. And in one file, you get beautiful display. And also the other cool thing about SVG too is that when the web developer gets it, if they want to animate it, they can animate SVG files. They can animate like object by object. They can change the color of it in code. SVG files are just so much more flexible than pixel-based graphics. Well, hey, so we're a little bit over halfway through, and we'd like to take a 5-minute stretch break, and we're going to put up a quick timer here for you so we don't lose track of time. So go ahead and take a 5-minute stretch break, restroom break, go grab a drink. I'm going to put on the timer, put a little music on. We'll do Q&A at the end, so this isn't Q&A time, just 5-minute timer. Go grab a drink, use the restroom. Okay, back to it. So, still have a bunch of things to talk about. I know we haven't talked about the other design apps, and I definitely want to talk about those. All right. One thing before we continue. For web, I think all you need is 1x and 2x. I know that for applications, things like Apple expect you to create 1x, 2x, and 3x. Android has a bunch of different resolutions that they want you to design for. But for the web, there's a reason why Apple called it the Retina display. Anything really beyond 2x, you cannot see a difference. Now, Apple even came out with a 3x display. The iPhone 6 Plus, when they created that Plus model, that was a 3x display. And I thought, well, so they called it the Retina HD display. And I thought, hey, Apple, why did you create an even higher resolution display? If you don't need anything higher than Retina, why did you create an even higher resolution? So I was curious. I went to the Apple store and I took a look at it, and it did not look any better than the 2x display. I could not see the difference. I think I had pretty good eyesight, and I don't need glasses for looking at things close. I could not see a difference physically between the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus. And the same thing is true of the 7 and the 7 Plus. So you don't see any difference. Keep in mind, some people that don't have perfect vision can't even see the difference between 1x and 2x. So even if there was the slightest difference between 2 and 3x, the increase in file size of going from 2 to 3x is certainly not worth it, because web pages are going to take longer to download. So I just don't think you need to go anything higher than 2x. I just don't think it's necessary. And in some cases, if you already have a lot of graphics on your page, for some things like photographs, sometimes you don't even go to 2x, or maybe you go a little bit more than 1x. It's not a hard thing necessarily that you have to go fully from 1x to 2x. Maybe you go like 1.5x because you just want to be a little bit better quality than 1x. You got to balance quality and file size. That's your balance. You want good performance and good graphics, and you don't just say, oh, I only want good graphics and it's okay if it takes a long time for the web page to load. It's a balancing act. Remember that resolution on the web is fluid, so you don't have to worry about always being crisp and clean 1x and 2x. It could be flexible. For example, on my personal site here, when I have this Mac tips page, for example, I think this graphic, if I remember right, I made the background graphic 2400 pixels. Now it's even higher resolution. It's not a specific resolution. Now, if somebody has a huge screen and they keep going higher and higher and higher, it's going to degrade in quality as they go up. So, eventually, if they have a giant 30-inch screen, this is going to eventually get lower and lower quality. But there's 2400 pixels, so that should be pretty good. Should be pretty good for most displays. And so that's really all you want to do, is just make sure that you have enough pixels to be appropriate for the device that you're going, and balance. Like in this case, I really didn't have many other graphics on the page. And since I really didn't have many other graphics on the page, I could afford to go with a nice high-res graphic at the top. So you just have to decide what's more important, performance or visual quality, and how can you balance the two. Okay, so let's move on from Photoshop and talk about some of the other apps. Now, a tip in Illustrator. So I mentioned about this for saving SVG files. This is going to be one of those great tips, and a lot of people don't know this tip. This is worth attending the seminar just for this. If this is only the one thing you learn, if you use Illustrator to make SVG files, this is going to be worth it. Okay, so if you have all this space around your file, that's going to be included in the SVG file. And you don't want that space to be there. You really just want the art to be there. So you need to pull in the artboard to your art. But it's very tedious to bring all this stuff in. Even though it does kind of snap, it's kind of tedious. So here's the trick. Use your artboard tool and double click on your art. Bam. Done. Double clicking on your art will snap it to whatever's visible. Such a sweet little trick. Now, if it's ungrouped, it's going to go to the ungrouped element. So you might have to group first. So, so let me just ungroup this. Let me see. I have a clipping mask. Let me get rid of the clipping mask. Okay, so now these are all like separate things. So if you try this, you might get a double click to do something like that, which is not what you want either. So if you have a bunch of things, just group them first. Now you have a group, which is one thing. And so now you can use your artboard tool, double click, bam. You got exactly the right size. Super, super time saver. Very, very good. And so now you can export as your SVG file. Okay. Now, another thing you can also do in the latest version of Illustrator is, I'm going to open up this Illustrator file here. They added a thing kind of like Photoshop does where you can export individual assets using the Asset Export panel. So if you can't find it over there, you can go to Window, Asset Export. If you don't have this, upgrade to a newer version of Illustrator. I think this was added in 2017, if I remember right. Yep, in 2017. So you need the 2017 CC 2017 version of Illustrator to get the Asset Export. And this panel is kind of like Adobe Generator in Photoshop. Let's say you want to export the logo. So you can drag the logo into there and then name it logo. So it's not using your layer names, but it is exporting out pieces of art. In this case, it's just going to export whatever you dragged in, and there will be no extra space around it. So that's nice. Now, if you want to export all of these as one thing, you can select them all and drag them in. Or let me undo that. And if I want them individually, you can drag them in, or you can just click the New button. So I can select that, New, Select, New, Select, New. So this could be social, Facebook, social, Pinterest, social, Instagram, social, Twitter. So you give them all nice web file names. And then right now, these are all set to SVG, but you can set them to different things. So if you need a PNG or you need a JPEG, you can export these different things. If you're doing a pixel-based version, not that I would in this case, but let's say here, if you were exporting this JPEG, if you designed this in Illustrator, you could create a new one for that. I'll call this Hero. That would be a JPEG. And let's say 50, let's go to like an 80% quality on that. And I don't need a suffix to know that that was an 80% quality. Just the file name is fine. But I'd want to have another size. In this case, I've designed it 1x. So I'd want to add 2x as a JPEG. Again, I don't need the quality on there. Just want the 2x. So it scales it at the current size, 100% with that quality, creates a 2x one that adds the @2x to the base file name and exports that. So you can export pixel-based 1x and 2x, and then SVGs where you don't have to worry about that. Okay. So let me take this, and I'm just going to select that hero and export that to my desktop. I'm going to create a folder called Output and export that there. Then I'm going to take all these guys and export them as an SVG. And with those selected, export. Oh, now, before I do that, remember what the default settings were when I exported this from Illustrator earlier? It had that responsive option checked. You want to make sure that you go into the, oh, not there, cancel. In the little menu over here and do, I think it's format settings. Yes. Yeah, so the little menu right here, format settings, go to SVG and uncheck responsive. It was unchecked because I did it when I exported before, but just make sure, or maybe this was done because I've already done this in the past. I can't remember, but just make sure that that's unchecked. It's normally checked. You have to uncheck it. Now I can export all those SVG files. And so let's go to my desktop and check out my output. Here's my JPEGs. Oh, it looks like, oh, Illustrator, including some white space in my JPEG. Not so good there for Illustrator. Here's the SVG file. Now, if you're previewing on the desktop and the Mac, ignore that there's all this white space there. That's just a preview that the desktop does. It's not actually there in the SVG file. You can know that if you ever open that back up in Illustrator and you see that the artboard is not, it doesn't have all that empty space there. But we got individual little icons for all of those things. So that's pretty sweet. You don't have to make a separate new file, crop it down. You can just export those individual assets right out from one thing. We have a question in the chat. Can you export a raster image as an SVG? Will it convert it to vector? No, it will not. It'll keep it as a pixel-based graphic. Illustrator, of course, has ways that you can convert a pixel-based graphic to vector, but that creates a special look, and pixel-based graphics are still going to be pixel-based graphics. Vector-based or vector-based. That's why we have these two different types of things. Things that are photographic are best represented by pixels. Things that are graphic and drawn, crisp, clean shapes are best done as vectors. So we still need JPEGs. We still need SVG. We're just, for things like icons, we need PNG a lot less. Right? So now much more of my graphics are just being split between SVG and JPEG for the most part. Those are two of the predominant formats that I'm using today. So let's back up a second. I mentioned that this was designed at 1x. So how do we design in Illustrator compared to Photoshop? Well, it's all different because this is a vector application. So in Illustrator, when you design, you can design at 1x. So let's say you go in here and you do a web layout in Illustrator at 1280. That's fine. It's what you would talk about in code, but like a browser that understands that the kind of coded 1280 is going to use more hardware pixels, Illustrator knows that too. Plus, when you're designing with for SVG files, it doesn't really matter so much, because if they need to override the size when they code the web page, they always can. But you want to give it a 1x size, so that when they bring it into the web page, it'll come in at the correct size. This is still going to look nice on my Retina display because it's a vector output. In fact, even when I zoom in, it still looks nice because it's all a vector output. So it's okay to design in 1x files in Illustrator. I can view this at actual size, as they call it. That's the 100% size. And this is going to be the correct size on any display. If you're on a high-res display, it's going to look better. But on a low-res display, it's still going to be the same correct size. So Illustrator is not so tricky. You just design at 1x. All your type sizes are normal. If you do 12 pixels, that's going to be 12 pixels in your web page. Everything in Illustrator kind of correlates to the way that a web page would be coded because it's vector. And in a web page, you can have vectors. So that's nice. It's easier in Illustrator. Just do everything as 1x. And for the most part, export as SVG. And that's basically the same idea as Sketch and XD, Adobe Experience Design. So let me go over to Sketch. Same kind of idea. Let me open up a Sketch file that I've done. Files. So here's the same web page done as Sketch. And it was done as a 1x file. So if you're starting out from scratch in Sketch, you say File New. And then you can insert your artboards. Insert artboard. And over here, notice that all the sizes that you see are all 1x sizes. So the iPhone SE or the iPhone 5, it's 320 pixels. That's the coded CSS pixel size, your 1x size. And when I view that as actual size, that's the correct size on any display. Whether I have a high-res display or a low-res display, it's always the correct size. On a high-res display, it's going to look better, of course, than a low-res display, but it'll be the correct size that you see it. All of your type sizes that you do are going to be 1x CSS equivalent type sizes. So it's so much easier to work this way in Illustrator in Sketch and Adobe Experience Design. Let me switch over to Adobe Experience Design. Adobe Experience Design is a beta application that Adobe's put out publicly, and it's very similar to the way that Sketch works. So the same thing here, I can say, hey, let's create a web 1280, and it creates an artboard that is 1280. If I insert an artboard, over here, my artboard tool, notice just like in Sketch, I have the same presets over here. So I could do an iPhone 5 or SE at the same 320. So Sketch, Illustrator, Adobe Experience Design, they're all talking those 1x pixels. You can trust their 100% zoom to be the accurate size. It's just a matter of how good is your display. Your display is the limiting factor. If you have a low-res display, you're going to see low-res quality. If you're on a high-res display, you'll see high-res quality. But at least your size is going to be the same. Your type sizes that you're doing are going to be the same numbers that you're seeing when you code. It's really only Photoshop that you have to worry about, am I working in a 2x file or a 1x file? Now, of course, in Illustrator and in Sketch and in XD, you have to bring in assets that are high enough quality, right? So even if this is 320 pixels, I can't only bring in an image that's 320. I need to bring in images that are at least 640 because I know that I have to be twice that to go to my 2x size. Now, let me go back here for a moment to Sketch. If I want to export SVG files from Sketch, I just go down here to Make Exportable and choose my SVG format, and there you go. Sketch codes in the width and height, so you don't have to worry about that responsive option like you have to worry about in Illustrator. Also, I think it's easier to do the SVG exports here. What I like about the way that Sketch does it is whatever your layer name or group name is over here, that's going to be your file name. So if I just select a bunch of things, I've already given it a name. Unlike in Illustrator where I have to name it specifically in the export, here I just like to name it the file that I'm going to get. And then I just make it exportable, and boom. Each individual thing is going to be exported with their appropriate name. If I wanted to export the set of them as all 4, I could still select the group and make that exportable as one piece if for some reason I want to export it as one piece, but I don't really want to do that. I want to export each one as a separate SVG. So each thing you have selected, when you click Make Export, it's going to export each element as a separate item. To me, that's a positive. That's a good thing. So this will be called Hipster Logo because the layer name is called that. If I want to export a JPEG, I can select this and export that as a JPEG. And then I can add a plus to do the 2x JPEG. And again, unlike Illustrator, which adds like the quality as like a hyphen at the end, I don't know why they do that. I never want a hyphen in the end. Excuse me. This lets me do the sizing. I do like the exporting in Sketch, but there is one kind of gotcha. But first, let me just export this so you can see. So I've marked all those things for export. Now I can click the export button at the top right. I'll click export there. And it exports everything that I've marked for export. If I don't want them all, I can come back in and just export specific things. But I want to get them all. Let's export. The main thing I don't like about Sketch in its export is that you have one JPEG quality for everything in the entire file. For all sizes, 1x and 2x in the entire file, and you can't preview it. So that to me is the biggest drawback, because remember what I said before, your 2x JPEGs should be more heavily compressed. You should have a lower quality for your high-res JPEGs. Your low-res JPEGs need a higher quality. So I really wish they'd split this into 2 sliders. Or let me define the quality when I'm setting it here in the Make Exportable. But at least if they gave me 2 qualities, like a 2x JPEG quality and a 1x JPEG quality, I'd love to be able to split those. I know I sent them a feature request quite a while ago. It could have been over a year ago that I sent them a feature request. If you'd like to see that same option, please send another feature request so that more people are requesting it and saying that they'd like to see it added to Sketch, because they said it sounded like a good idea, but it's been quite a while and they never implemented that. So it doesn't seem like it's a super high priority for them. I'd love to see this be implemented. In the meantime, what I have to do is I have to create a folder for 1x quality, and I have to create a folder for 2x quality. Now in the 2x quality, of course, I can go lower. I'm just going to guess, well, I know before I did this at 35, so let's do 35 again here. Now I'm going to do a second export. And into the 1x quality, I'm going to do the higher quality, like so. All right. So at least I got the files exported. The only thing is now I have two folders that I need to kind of assimilate together, right? So let me create a new folder called Good Images. Oops, I got to take off my caps lock. Good Images. So all my SVG files, I can move into there because they're not affected by JPEG quality. Same thing with PNG. I can move all those into Good Images. So really it just came down to the JPEGs. So let's go in and, down here. Let's take, and I only need to worry about the JPEG. So that one and that one. So let's toss all the rest. Okay. So in the 1x quality, this one's good. The appropriate quality for 1x. So I can toss that one in the trash. Let's view this by name, sorry. And in the 2x quality, the 2x is good. That's the appropriate quality. So I can toss the 1x. And now I have the two files that I need at the appropriate quality. Notice they're not too different in file size. The 2x is only a little bit bigger than the 1x. And now I can move those into my Good Images. So it's a little annoying that I have to do two exports and then kind of put them together in the appropriate one. If you're not being careful, you can kind of be confused about that. So I can do it. It's just I wish it were easier. I do like the way that Photoshop does their asset generation, that you can just specify the quality directly on the image. I really do like that. I like Sketch better as a design application. I feel like it's easier to design in Sketch, but I do like the Adobe generator aspect of Photoshop. So no program is perfect. There's pros and cons of Photoshop and Sketch. And, based on the question in the chat, yeah, just a reminder, the 1x quality, you have to do a higher quality. So it's less compression. The 2x is lower quality, so that means it's more compression. Okay. All right, so that's how I do it in Sketch. Sketch is really, I think for the SVG export, it's got a really nice workflow for the SVG export, but the JPEG export is lacking. I wish they would improve that. That would be better. Another thing that, let's say you have to create a PNG of a logo. Maybe you're doing an HTML newsletter and you can't use SVG in a newsletter for an email, right? So let's say you're going to send out an email. Emails can't use SVG yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. So let's say you're not doing a web page. You're going to do an email. Maybe you need a PNG version of this. You can export from Sketch. You can export a PNG, but it's always a PNG 24, a transparent PNG. Let me export that to my desktop and save that. Now, because it's a PNG 24, that means it's millions of colors. Now, it's not a big file size. It's only 4K, but it is bigger than it needs to be. We can reduce the file size of PNG 24. So PNG 24 is 24 bits. That means millions of colors. There's PNG 8s that we can export that are 256 colors. But Sketch only lets you export PNG 24s. So always the PNGs from Sketch are millions of colors, even if you don't need it. I want to convert it down to being only PNG 8, which is 256 colors. So there is a free little Mac app called ImageOptim. Now, if you're on PC, there's not an exact equivalent, but the closest that you can get is a website called TinyPNG. So if you're on Windows, you can go to tinypng.com, and this is pretty much for the most equivalent, pretty close, and you could drop your PNGs on here. It also does some JPEG compression too, but I'm talking about doing alpha versions for your PNGs. So you'd be using the website instead of this app. If you're on a Mac, in the handout there's links to this app, but it's a free app called ImageAlpha. Even if you just Google ImageAlpha, you'll come across the link to it. And what ImageAlpha lets you do is take a PNG 24, just drop it on, and you can convert it down to 256 colors or less. Now in this case, let me turn off smooth scaling because I don't want it to change the display there. See, it's still transparent, even though it's only 256 colors. Now in this case, it saved me 14% of my original file size. I don't really need 256 colors for a logo like this. So I could probably hack that down maybe even to 8. If I show the original versus this versus original, that's maybe like 2 pixels change, but nothing important there. And I just saved 70% of my file size. 70%. Now let's say you're not too impressed because this is only going from like 4K to 1K. Okay, I still think it's important to do the smallest file size as possible, but let's say you weren't impressed with that. You want something a little more impressive. Okay, so let me show you. Yeah. Okay, so let's take an image like this. So in this case, maybe you needed something where you have a pixel-based graphic, but you needed transparency. So you need a PNG file because it's pixel-based with transparency, and that's really the only file format you have that supports pixel-based with transparency. This was a PNG 24 that we exported. Going down to a PNG 8, which is 256, we just saved 63% of the file size. It went from 81K to 30.5K. You could try going even less, and now we're down to 70% savings. And if you look at the difference here, let's zoom in. There is some loss of quality if I show the original, but it's possible, depending on how your screen is and the webcast, you might not be able to see the difference. But there is, if you look very closely, there is some banding, some striping that is occurring. Even at 256, well, it's not quite as bad actually at 256, but still there's a little bit. But at a normal size, at the 1x normal size that this is, not zoomed in, 2x down here just means 200%. They should have said 100%, 200%. I can't notice the difference between the original and the finished. It actually amazes me that with this many colors, that 256 looks okay. I would have thought that 256 colors was not enough to represent this graphic. But from 81K down to 30K, that's pretty amazing. In fact, I think we could even go down to the 128 colors. I think that's still pretty darn good. Now, when you do this, I wish that you could just hit save and save over your original, but they don't want you to accidentally do that because you are losing information. I don't mind doing that once I've made my decision, so I am going to save as and save over my original in my normal workflow. Just to compare though, so that you can see, I'm going to say -optimized, just so you can compare the difference here. I'll talk about this in just a moment. Let's uncheck that for right now. So look at the difference there. 82 down to 82 down to 25. That's just an amazing difference in file size. But we're not quite done yet. The people that make ImageAlpha also make another cool app called ImageOptim, which that little checkbox that I unchecked kind of talked about. ImageOptim is another great free app for the Mac that I highly recommend any web designer get. All of your images that you export, any pixel-based graphic, whether it's a JPEG, a PNG, or a GIF, they're all bigger than they need to be. They can all be reduced with no loss of quality, just loss of file size. Unfortunately, there's not an exact equivalent on Windows, but you do have some websites that you can choose from that kind of do the same types of things. The Tiny PNG does PNGs and JPEGs, and they also have the tinyjpeg.com. Oh, I think no E. Yeah. Same thing. They merged these two websites now. It used to be, actually I didn't realize that they used to be that they were separate ones. Now you can drop either of them on, and that will shrink it down. Okay. They're a little differently because in this, I'm not sure about the JPEG, whether you lose quality in this or not. I know the PNG you might, because it's like Image Alpha. You're going to, the goal is to actually reduce file size by losing a little bit of quality. You don't need those number of colors. I'm not sure about the JPEG. It doesn't work with GIF, so I don't have a great one for doing GIFs, although most of the time we don't use GIFs anymore. We mostly use PNGs. But I haven't found an exact equivalent that's as good as ImageOptim for Windows. ImageOptim is great. All you do is you just take a folder of images and you just drop it on, or a single image. Let's take this. Right now, this is 25K. Let's drop it on. And it goes through and it crunches through a bunch of different algorithms. There are many different ways you can compress a PNG. They're finding the best algorithm for optimizing it. They just saved another 7.2% and just rewrote it over the file. It dropped from 25K down to 23K. So, hey, there's another 7.2% gone with no loss of quality at all. ImageOptim, you could just toss a whole folder on and go grab some lunch, or go do some work in another program, and you never lose any quality. You just lose file size. Here's a real life graphic that I created that shows the most that I've probably ever saved. This was when we announced eBooks on our website. I wanted to make this animation, which was actually, it was a video that I had to capture of these screens doing that page turn. And when I exported it from Photoshop, I got a 4.1 megabyte animated GIF. So here I've duplicated it just so you can see two ones that are the same size. I'm going to optimize this one so we can still compare it file size to this one. So let's just drop it on. Boom. There goes 84% of the file size. It went from 4.1 megs to 0.6 with no loss of quality. That's it. Just lost file size and no degradation in any other way. So this is great for HTML emails, which is exactly, we use this in our email to announce the ebooks. But any web graphic you create, they should all be funneled through ImageOptim. And it doesn't matter whether it's a JPEG, a GIF, a PNG, it optimizes them all losslessly. You just lose file size. JPEGs, you only lose a couple percent because there's not a whole lot they can do with JPEGs. They're not recompressing with a different algorithm. They're just removing some cruft from the file. But PNGs and GIFs, they're actually finding different algorithms to compress it, finding different ways to order the information so that it's more efficient. And that you can see anywhere from like 5 to 85% reduction. I'd say on average, it's more like the 5 to 25% reduction is kind of the average. But I was blown away that this saved me 85% practically of my file size. Just huge. If you are ever creating animated GIFs for banner ads or for HTML email, they're really big in HTML email. This can be an amazing tool. I wish I found one good for Windows. I had found one, and then that app went away. It was a $25 app, but it's gone off the web now, so can't recommend that anymore because it's gone. So if you do find an app that can do PNG, GIF, and JPEG, all like ImageOptim, but it's for Windows, please let us know, because I've searched and spent hours doing it, and I just haven't found an exact equivalent for Windows. I love that it's local, that it works on my machine, that I could just toss any file format on it, and there's no loss of quality except for loss of file size. That to me is priceless. So yeah, and you could just take literally a whole folder, and like in this case, this is a 1.5 meg folder of web graphics. Let me just duplicate that and just drop it on. And it just looks in that folder and just boom, just cranks through. And let me delete these other two. So in that folder down here, it saved me 109K out of 1.5 megs, 7.1% overall, a maximum of 15.5%. This is a bit more average for a typical thing. But that's pretty awesome by just throwing it on. Don't be surprised if your fans really start to crank when this is going on, especially if you have big images, because it does do a lot of math behind the scenes, and it's going to take a lot of processor power to do that. So your fans will calm down once it's all done. So some great little tips there. And I should mention that if you're exporting from Photoshop, the latest versions of Photoshop finally got a better PNG export. Let me open up my Photoshop file. Let me just open up this. Yeah, so let me just take this logo and duplicate it into a new file. Just real quick here, new file. Okay, and I'm just going to trim this. Get rid of the transparent pixels. Okay, so let's say you want to export this. Save for Web is going away, and there's still some things that I like about Save for Web, but Save for Web has never had a transparent PNG 8 export. The PNG 8 from Save for Web, the semi-transparency never worked. It could do transparency, but it was always an on or off transparency. And it always bothered me because I knew that PNGs were better than Save for Web. When you do PNG 8, see, there's no transparency in this, in the anti-aliasing. There's white stuff and gray stuff there. It's not partially transparent. It's either there or it's not. So you couldn't use the PNG 8 from Save for Web. But when they added Export As, they got a better PNG 8 optimizer. In here, when you choose PNG, if you check on smaller file size, that gives you a PNG 8 with partial transparency. So from Photoshop now, you can export that nice small PNG 8. So you wouldn't need ImageOptim. Sorry, not ImageOptim. You wouldn't need Image Alpha. You'd still want ImageOptim because it's still a little bigger than it needs to be. But the Image Alpha is only for really cutting down transparent PNG 24s down to PNG 8. That's all Image Alpha does. And so we need that for Sketch. We need it for Adobe Experience Design. I haven't talked about Adobe Experience Design much yet. Let me just switch over there real quick. Adobe Experience Design, I think they're still going to be doing a lot of work in the graphics exporting side of things because it's very bare bones right now. For example, if you export an asset that you have selected, one of the biggest things is you can't export as a JPEG yet from Adobe Experience Design. Now, Experience Design is kind of, Adobe is creating a competitor to Sketch. They both try to do web or app design, user interface or user experience design. They're really designing for screens. And so they're building it up. They're still missing a bunch of features. It's definitely showing a lot of promise, and they are adding new features pretty rapidly, but it's still missing some features, namely JPEG export. That's a pretty big oversight. Now, I know they're going to add it, so it's not really an oversight per se. It's just, they just haven't gotten to it yet, I should say. It's not an oversight. They just haven't done it yet. They will. I know they're going to. It's just they haven't done it yet. So that's what makes XD a little bit hard to use right now for production work because you can't export JPEGs. You'd have to export as a PNG and then open up in Photoshop or something and export it again as a JPEG, and that would be really tedious to do. It can export SVG, which is good. I would optimize that. And it can export PNGs. And if you're exporting for web, you would choose that you're exporting it for web, and it's going to create a 1x and a 2x for you. It does export a PNG 24, so if you want to convert it down to a PNG 8, you'll have to run it through Image Alpha or the tinypng.com. That'll give you the PNG 8 if you don't need all those extra colors. Okay, so in terms of workflow, XD and Sketch and Illustrator, much more similar workflows to each other because they're all vector-based graphics. The Photoshop workflow is the one that's the most different out of all of these guys. I do want to open up into the chat for questions. Before you head out, just a couple housekeeping things. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more notifications of videos that we post. Also, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up down below. Click the little thumbs up button if you don't mind. And We have classes if you want to dive deeper into these programs. I know we just talked about the optimization of it and a little bit about file size creation, but if you're less familiar with these programs, you might want to take our experience design class or our sketch class or our Photoshop for web class. So we do have a class for each one of these apps. We do teach Illustrator, although that class is not focused on just creating web graphics, because out of all of these, I would say that things like Photoshop and Sketch are the most popular for creating their web graphics. So we do talk about creating graphics of all type in the Illustrator class, but it's not just a web-focused class. But the Photoshop for web, that's for doing web and apps. Experience design would be web and apps, and Sketch would also be web and apps. Those are our kind of web graphics focused programs. Each of those has a workbook. We don't quite have the experience design book on the website yet. It will be coming up here once I upload it, but I just have to upload that. It'll be up there hopefully soon. You can also check out in the books tab, books page up here. You can check out, if you look at the web books, you can check out our books there. So we have an animated GIFs. Also, if you want to create animated GIFs, we have a great animated GIFs book, and Sketch. We have one for Sketch, and we will be uploading the Adobe Experience Design book shortly. We just finished that class and that book literally just last week. So it's brand new class, brand new book. So definitely check out some of the classes. Like I said, all those kind of classes you can attend in person or live online. So even if you can't make it to New York City, you can still take the class. You just screen share into the instructor's computer. You hear him speaking kind of like you hear me talking on the microphone here. And yeah. Okay, let me look in here on the chat. Oh, okay. So one of the questions is, can you use ImageOptim with something like the WP Smush It, which is WP is for WordPress? There are some times where you can have a server optimized workflow, and you ought to see if there's any benefit to running a local version versus the server. That ImageOptim actually, speaking of the server one, they actually just created a web service. So you can run the local Mac app, or you can run it as a web service on your web server, so that you don't have to run it locally, that anybody that uploads things to the website, that the website itself can kind of optimize it. So WordPress can have plugins like Smush It, where the website itself does that optimization. You just have to compare that optimization to something like ImageOptim. There are different algorithms behind the scenes. Some are more efficient than others. What I really like about ImageOptim is that it has so many different algorithms, and that's why it takes a little while to work, because it cycles through every algorithm that it knows and finds the best one. Some of these other services might only have one or two algorithms, so it might not do quite as good of a job, but maybe it's good enough. So you just have to compare it. I would say upload an image without the compression through ImageOptim, upload another one with it, so one without and one with, and just see what your server does to see if it compresses it. Oh, and then the follow-up question is, will you lose quality if you do it both locally and on the server? It all depends on the type of server compression. If the server is doing a lossy compression, then you want to be careful about it over compressing. Things like ImageOptim are lossless. It does not lose any quality. It only loses file size. I would hope that a server-side compression would not be a lossy compression. I wouldn't want that when I upload my images that it would always be further reducing the quality. I don't think most server optimizations would do that. So most likely you're fine doing it locally and online. It's just a matter of, do you need to bother doing the local one if your server's already doing it? That's the whole idea of the server doing it. You don't have to do it twice. All right, so Betty's asking about best local server. I'm not sure what you mean, like best like MAMP or XAMP or something like that. I'm not sure if that's what your question is. You're very welcome, those of you who are thanking me in the chat. Oh, yeah, and don't forget, download in the notes. There's the link to download the PDF. I'm going to paste this into the chat for those of you who are attending live. But if you're watching the recording of this video, look in the video description down below and download the PDF. There's a bunch of notes and links. There's links to all the like the apps that I talked about. There's a link to ImageOptim, to the Tiny PNG website. Lots of notes taken down there for you. Links to the blog posts that I wrote about 1x and 2x in Photoshop. All right, so I'll hang out for another couple minutes here in the chat, but it looks like that's kind of dying down. So just wanted to say thanks, everybody, again, for joining us today. Please click the thumbs up to like the video. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Any of you who attended live, will send you out a link to this recording, and it will also be posted here on our YouTube channel as well. Be sure to check out the classes and the workbooks to learn more detailed information, but hope you got a lot out of this and some cool tips and tricks that you didn't know beforehand. Hope to see you in a future video. Dan Rodney signing out for Noble Desktop. See you in the next live stream.